Hi, and welcome to this live reading from The Killer Jack Mystery, the J.D. Pierson Casefiles Book 2 by C.H. Sessums, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Tyler, Texas, Fall, 1936. The speedy tap-tap-tap-tap-zip of our Underwood typewriter acted as a sort of hypnotic melody in the background as I focused my attention wholly on the task before me. In honesty, I despised being a typist, but I was good at it, and at the moment I needed every dime I could earn to keep from starving to death. Attorney Dale Fletcher officed 3 floors up from us and has asked if I could give him some ancillary help this week. It turned out his business had also seen a downturn in the last few months, whose hadn't, with the depression on, and he'd decided to let his longtime secretary, Edna Pomeroy, go. I might have felt bad for Edna, but the day I saw her leaving the building with a cardboard box containing her few desk belongings, she'd confessed that she'd wanted to retire years ago. She'd only stayed on because he'd begged her to. I have an older sister down near Houston, never get to see her anymore, and she's getting up in age, you know, she told me, and since I was sure Edna was at least in her mid-60s, I could only wonder how old her sister might be. Anyway, she's been wanting me to come live with her. Soon as Mr. Fletcher broke the news about laying me off, I started packing my things. I'll be on the bus first thing tomorrow morning. So, for the last 3 days, I'd been hunkered down in front of this typewriter, preparing miscellaneous legal documents for him. Tap, tap, tap. I paused after hitting the carriage return, looking over my work, and flinched when I saw the error I'd made a few words back. With a little tisk, I turned the platen knob with one hand while I pulled out the eraser shield with the other. There was nothing worse than correcting multiple carbon copies. I grumbled to myself again about how much I hated typing and also inwardly fussed at my father for putting me in this position in the first place. Of course, I couldn't entirely blame him. If not for his office, I might have ended up a full-time typist years ago anyway. And then I might have even ended up like Edna, laid off due to the hard times. Holding the eraser shield between my teeth, I reset the papers while I wriggled my sore backside in my seat. Just as I was about to begin again, a knock on the door drew my attention. I glanced at the shadow behind the frosted glass. "Come in," I called out, standing and forcing a smile. "Good afternoon, Miss Pierson," Attorney Fletcher said as he took a few long strides towards the desk. "Pardon me for bursting in on you like this." Oh, it's all right, but I'm sorry I haven't quite finished with the last file. I glanced at the name on the papers. The Tillman wills?" Fletcher waved a hand, then raised it to scratch at his balding head. His tie was loose around his collar, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and he looked as if he hadn't slept in a few days. I assumed that was probably true, since I was aware he was preparing for a trial next week. "No apologies, Miss Pierson, but I do need to grab the Cartwright file from you before I head home. I'm supposed to run out to Edam to meet them tomorrow morning." Yes," I nodded, then rummaged through nervously, stacking up the projects I'd completed and handing them to him. "Tillman is the only one I'm still working on." Fine, he muttered, then reached into his pocket. He passed me an envelope with my name on it, and I could tell by the jingle that it was probably my pay. We hadn't talked specifics about what he would give me for my work. After all, beggars couldn't afford to be choosers. Besides, I knew Dad thought Mr. Fletcher was one of the most honest men he'd ever met, especially for a lawyer. So I had to assume he was paying me what he could afford. "Thank you again for your help, Miss Pierson," he said as he shuffled toward the door, his arms laden with files. "I know you must be busy with your father's work, so I really appreciate your time." "Not at all, Mr. Fletcher." I reached for the knob and held the door open for him. "I'm happy to help. I'll have the Tillman wills to you tomorrow, and if you need me again, please just call." With a frown, Fletcher stopped and turned, scanning the office as if for the first time noticing how silent it was. "Where is J.D. anyway? I haven't seen him in ages." I swallowed down the truth and stretched my lips into a wider faux grin. "He's out of town on business. I'm sure you'll see him next week." Fine, he said again, then made his way down the hallway. "Tell him I said hello." When he was gone, I took another glance at the Tillman last will and testament sticking out of the typewriter and weighed how much patience I had left to finish the project. Pouring out the contents of the envelope Mr. Fletcher had given me, I stared at it with disappointment, then finally made my decision. $7.50 wouldn't pay the office rent, but it was a start. With a sigh, I picked up my purse and grabbed my jacket from the coat tree, peering at our quiet office one last time before flicking the lights and starting down the hallway. Pausing just before turning the corner, I glanced back at the door, peering at the black words on the opaque glass. J.D. Pierson, Investigator. I'd told Mr. Fletcher that my father would be back next week. I only hoped I could keep things afloat for him while he made his way through his latest bender. Chapter 2. I managed to pick up several more days of work from Mr. Fletcher over the course of the following week, and by Thursday he'd given me another $3.25 pay. I wanted to deposit part of my week's earnings into the savings account I'd opened up for us, but the truth was I was dog-tired, sullenly depressed, and just plain ready to get home and kick my shoes off. So instead of going to the bank, I walked across the courthouse square to the Brookshire's grocery store to get some provisions before heading home. I'd bartered for some eggs the day before with Mrs. Lewis down the street from our house. I figured I could put some of the money toward our store bill, then get some bacon and tomatoes to make a light dinner. I might even be able to manage a few sundry other necessities. I was pleased a few minutes later when I left the store with $3 and some change still in my wallet. Added to that which I'd managed to save over the last few weeks, I'd be able to make our rent payment next week. The clouds had threatened rain that morning, and though downtown was close enough that I could walk from our house, I'd decided to take Dad's Model A to the office. I hadn't seen my father before leaving the house at 9 or so, and hoped he would stay in bed sleeping off the booze he'd spent the previous day imbibing. "Dad," I said loudly as I opened the door and dropped my handbag onto the table just beside the door. "I'm home, Dad." Carrying the bag with my groceries into the kitchen, I called out to my father one more time while I started to unload them. After a few minutes, I heard the door to his bedroom open, and he trudged into the room to offer me a smile. He had a week's worth of scraggly growth on his chin, and there were dark circles under his bloodshot eyes. The shirt he wore was splotched with stains, and I was sure that if I went into his bedroom, I'd find empty bottles of bootlegged liquor throughout. Thankfully, I also knew he should now be out of liquor and money in his wallet to buy more. "Hello, Jenny dear," he said in a surprisingly chipper tone, scrubbing a hand over his chin. "Can't believe I slept the day away like this. Did I miss anything important?" I bit my tongue and pretended not to have heard him. It was getting to be harder and harder to maintain my patience with him over his utter disregard for our livelihood. Still, when I peered at him over the refrigerator door, sympathy managed to creep up into my heart. That hollow look that came into his eyes sometimes when he looked at me cut me to the core. I knew I resembled my mother, though I was not nearly as beautiful as she'd been. My mahogany hair was thick and naturally wavy. I also had her wide hazel eyes with long dark eyelashes. Still, my chin was a little strong, an attribute inherited from my father. At moments like these, when I was in the kitchen playing the domestic role, I felt it reminded him too much of her. And as badly as I missed her, I knew he did even more. I figured it was why he turned to the bottle as often as he did. More and more often lately. "You hungry?" he asked, seemingly to have startled himself out of whatever morose thoughts had started to overtake him. "Let your old man make some dinner, eh?" I inclined my head in agreement, taking a few eggs out of the box and setting them out for him, while I found a sharp knife to slice one of the tomatoes. Within just a few minutes, we were both sitting at a small table out on the back porch, plates of scrambled eggs, fried bacon, and tomatoes before us. We didn't say much. We just ate silently as we watched the sunset beyond the trees along the back half-acre of our property. My mother's garden looked sad now, unkempt in the years since she'd died. That first month or so, I'd been too bereft to even try to keep it up. Later, I'd realized I didn't have the heart for it. When we had the money, I would sometimes hire Mr. Potter to clean the weeds out of the beds. A colored man who did odd jobs around Tyler, he had at one time worked alongside my mother to keep up her roses, hydrangeas, and azaleas. And if I let him, he would recount to me little stories of her and how she liked to have things done while he did his work. I didn't let him often because I was afraid those memories might be too much to take. "She liked it here, Jenny," Dad said suddenly, drawing my attention. "Good old Model 115. Picked it out herself, you know, with some small modifications." I'd heard the story many times, especially while she was still living. Mom had even kept the original Sears Roebuck plans they'd purchased. The little two-story house was perfect for a young family just starting off, with a parlor, kitchen, and bedroom on the first floor, and another 2 bedrooms on the second. Later, when they became assured that I would be their only child, the lower bedroom became a study for Dad, and a bathroom was added upstairs. Now my father continued his musings, a faraway look on his face. "When she was carrying you, I'd find her sitting here, watching the sunset just like this. Should have come home earlier in those days, not gone away so much." I didn't know how I should respond, so I just sat there, staring at the orange glow along the horizon. I knew he carried guilt, so much guilt about my mom, about their lives together, about her death. The ghost of it haunted me too, and I was so afraid of getting lost by it that I just kept it bottled away most of the time. But Dad couldn't do that, clearly. It swallowed him up, wore him down, stole a little bit more of him daily. "Of course, then the next year," he grunted instead of finishing the last sentence. "The next year he'd gone off to war, and even before Mom's death he hadn't wanted to talk about those days either. I had been just a little girl, but as I'd grown older, I'd known that occasionally memories of his time in France had surfaced when he drank a little too much. But it seemed now, in retrospect, that maybe it was my mother who had kept him from letting the war nightmares bury him in the drink. With a nod, Dad seemed to declare an end to the short one-sided conversation, then reached for our plates with a slightly unsteady hand. "You go on to bed, Jenny. I'll do the cleaning up." "You cooked, so I should be the one." He fixed me with a kind of but resolute stare, and I knew I wouldn't win that argument, so I just smiled, patted his hand, and left him to it. A long bath and a good book were calling to me anyway, so I didn't mind not doing the dishes and tidying the kitchen. I was in bed by 8:30, a book perched on my knees and a soft light of my bedside lamp illuminating the room. Somewhere in my mind I might have heard the thump of the book when it fell from my hands onto the floor, but my eyes were already closed, and the dark edges of sleep were too alluring to deny. I tugged up my blankets and drifted fully into a hard sleep. I was awakened in the early morning hours by the sound of something crashing. In a panic, I leapt out of the bed, and ran toward the parlor in just my old cotton nightgown. There were car lights out in the front of the house, and the figures of two people in the shadows on the front porch. "Dad!" I called out in a loud whisper down the hall, but he grabbed his big coat from the closet and slipped it on. Then found my purse and the pistol tucked inside it. Holding the barrel upwards, I slowly opened the door, then felt acid churn in my belly when I recognized one of the men. "Dad!" I hissed, now setting the gun down and opening the door wide. "Jenny, good morning, my girl," he slurred, then tripped over his feet and stumbled to his knees, nearly bringing Barry Dobkins, one of his old school chums, down with him. I refused to help them, instead using both hands to hold the coat modestly closed in front. "Sorry, Miss Jenny," Dobkins said regretfully. "We were playing cards at my house till early this morning. Then J.D. got a flat on the way home over on Beaudark and ran her up onto the curb. The car's pretty well stuck for now, so I decided to see him home." I gazed down my nose at Dad as his friend tried to get him back to his feet. "Did you ruin the car?" I asked him when he cut his half-lidded eyes to me. "Oh," hurried Dobkins, "I don't think so. Just a tire, but it shouldn't cost too much." With a sigh, I put one hand under Dad's arm and guided him through the door. "Thank you, Mr. Dobkins, for seeing him home." Then, with a kick of my foot, I slammed it behind me. My thanks were genuine, but it didn't erase the ire I felt about how often my father went out and got drunk with him. As I was tucking my inebriated father into his bed, I thought of Mr. Dobkins' words. It shouldn't cost too much. I fled my father's room and ran to the front room, snatching up my purse and pulling out my wallet. Hand out, I poured the contents into my palm and stared forlornly at 2 quarters and a nickel. 55 cents was all that was left of what I'd worked so hard for. Instead, my father had pilfered the rent to pay for his bender, and not just his bender. Dad was a happy drunk, and he liked to spread the joy. He'd have purchased enough for all of his friends, too. I fisted the change and wished I had something to punch, but instead closed my eyes in silent disgust as I mentally confronted the question of whether I would ever be able to get us back into the black again.